Hi. Yesterday we discussed some of the things that were taking place in the first couple of years after World War II to lead to hostility between the United States and the Soviet Union. And you got into small groups and you had a discussion about um, which approaches to foreign policy the United States should take in response to these challenges. And today will be all about um, examining what the consequences of the actual policy the United States decided to pursue were in the aftermath of World War II, namely the containment policy. Um, the learning target will be for you to be able to describe the consequences of the policy of containment on the one hand. And then on the other hand, we'll also have a look at what in general were the causes of the Cold War. Given everything that you've been learning over the last couple of days, including in the readings that you've done, the question then will be, what, um, how might you contribute to the argument, to the debate that has taken place over many years um, around who was responsible for the Cold War? Was it the United States? Was it the Soviet Union? Was it some other factor that neither country could control, or was it both the U.S. and the Soviet Union, or some combination thereof? When we're done with that, then I will continue to explain what some of the policies that what some of the events that took place in the 1950s up to 1960, and how they reflected the containment policy that I'm about to describe to you. So, once again, yesterday you had a look at the various possible policies that people were advocating for in the United States, just at the beginning of the Cold War. One of those policies, a containment policy, that's the one that came to be the actual policy of the United States, and it was introduced at first by a man named George Kennan. And George Kennan was a diplomat who worked for the U.S. In the Soviet Union. He was an expert in the Soviet Union. And in 1946, he sends anonymously, actually, what comes to be known as the long telegram. And in the long telegram, Kennan explains that this is a telegram to the State Department, the Secretary of State, and ultimately to the for the President of the United States to read. And Kennan basically says that the Soviet Union doesn't understand reason. All they understand is the logic of force. As far as he's concerned, based on his knowledge of the Soviet Union, all they know, all they're convinced by, is military might. Otherwise, talk, he argued, would get Americans nowhere with the Soviet Union. And he explains why, and he goes into great detail. But then what's most important about his telegram is his proposal. He says that the United States, from now on, should take a policy of containing the Soviet Union. As he puts it, the United States must engage in long-term, patient, but firm containment of Russian expansive tendencies. In plain English, that means anywhere the Soviet Union wants to expand its influence, anytime the Soviet Union wants to increase the number of allies it has, any effort at all by the Soviet Union to reach out to other countries and to try to make friends with other countries, or worse, to influence other countries in the way that it did in Eastern Europe, must be met by the United States with a policy of containment, meaning the United States must stop them whenever they try to expand their influence. The idea here was that the United States will accept that the Soviets now have control over Eastern Europe, that the Soviets have some influence in parts of the Middle East, but anywhere else the Soviets, from this point on, try to expand their influence, the U.S. must stop them anywhere in the world, period. Now, the containment policy guided American policy once it was adopted, beginning in 1947 with the Truman Doctrine and going on into the 50s and 60s and 70s for decades. It was the official policy of the United States during the Cold War. Anywhere the Soviet Union goes, we will stop them, was the basic premise of that doctrine, of that policy. And where you first see it, of course, is in the Greek Civil War. Remember that the Soviet Union had been supplying, influencing the Greek communists as they tried to overturn the government of Greece in a civil war there in the 1940's. Remember that Harry Truman, the president, went to Congress and asked for money to support the government of Greece as it fought against these communist insurgents. When Truman gave a big speech in front of Congress to ask for this aid, and as you read, he pretty much said, any time there is a government or a country in the world, anywhere in the world, where that is being bullied by an outside power, say, and of course he implied the Soviet Union, although he never directly mentions them by name, or being threatened by an internal insurgency, like in Greece, then the United States must come to their aid. And he says we must do this everywhere and from now on. This became known as the Truman Doctrine. And Congress does indeed pass a law authorizing many hundreds of millions of dollars of aid to the Greeks and to Turkey, who was also being bullied and pressured by the Soviet Union, in compliance with this, in pursuit of this policy. And there's some information about that I just went over. Another episode of the containment policy early on was the Marshall Plan. The Marshall Plan, named after the Secretary of State Marshall, George Marshall, was designed to come to the economic aid of European countries. The idea behind the Marshall Plan was that countries like those in Western Europe that have been devastated by war and have suffered economic collapse are susceptible to communism. People when they get desperate economically, they turn to communism. That was the idea behind the Marshall Plan. And the Marshall Plan would help Western European countries avoid communism by funneling many, many hundreds of millions of dollars in aid to the Europeans from the U.S. This would also help to reestablish Europe as a market for American-made goods, which was, a win-win for Americans as well, as Marshall put it. And George Marshall and President Truman certainly offered, at least publicly, this aid to the Soviet Union, but the Soviet Union would have to have agreed to making some changes to their government that they were not interested in making. So they declined the aid, and they refused to let any Eastern European country receive Marshall Plan aid either. So here you see a map that shows you where all these many millions of dollars went in American aid after World War II. Millions of dollars that were used to rebuild struggling economies like those of Great Britain and France and Italy, our enemy in World War II, as well as Germany, also our enemy during World War II, and a bunch of other places. For many who supported the Marshall Plan, it was a way of pulling Europe out of this great abyss it was in economically and avoiding Europeans' turn to communism. For many, the Soviets' unwillingness to accept Marshall Plan aid or to let European Eastern European countries accept Marshall Plan aid, as this cartoon suggests, was a hypocritical thing. Um, Another episode in the early history of the containment policy was the establishment of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. The United States, in keeping with its general policy of internationalism after World War II, remember that the United States helped found the United Nations, the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, and here it is establishing the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, which still exists today, which was designed to help all of the countries in Western Europe that were allied with the U.S. to come together to defend for mutual self-defense. The idea was that the countries that belonged to NATO would help each other, defend each other, come to each other's defense whenever there were any threats to any of those countries. This is the end of George Washington's idea of avoiding entangling alliances. Now the United States is part of the United Nations, is part of NATO, and will continue to have a great role in international organizations like that. The Soviet Union sees the NATO as a way to keep them, ostracize them, to ostracize the Soviet Union, to encircle the Soviet Union, and to keep them out. And the Soviet Union, in response, organizes the Warsaw Pact, which is an organization of Eastern European countries primarily, that would come to the aid of each other's aid should they be threatened. So here you see now Europe is divided up into the NATO members of Western Europe, and to the Warsaw Pact members of Eastern Europe, and to countries that choose not to align themselves with either one. The United States, in keeping with its commitment to NATO and to its effort to keep the Soviets from expanding their sphere of influence into Western Europe, begins to establish military bases all over Europe. Every one of those countries in NATO, almost to the last one, agreed to allow the United States to build military bases there. The U.S. will keep many, many thousands of soldiers and millions and millions of dollars in military equipment, as well as later nuclear weapons, in Western Europe as part of its Cold War containment policy. Speaking of nuclear weapons, the nuclear arms race really heats up when the first Soviet Union atomic bomb explodes in 1949. Now it's official in 1949, only 4 years after the dropping of the first atomic bomb on Hiroshima and then Nagasaki. Now it's official, the Soviet Union has the atomic bomb, and the nuclear arms race begins between the United States and the Soviet Union. And it really gets crazy when the U.S. explodes the first hydrogen bomb in 1952, a bomb that is many times more destructive than the original atomic bomb that was dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So, the question now then is, these are the first kind of few years of the U.S. policy of containment and the official start of you might say, of the Cold War. An LEQ or DBQ prompt might read something like this. Evaluate the causes of the beginning of the Cold War between the U.S. and the Soviet Union from 1945 to 1950. What I'd like you to do now is I'd like you to think about that question and to write down your thoughts. Using the worksheet that I've given you, I'd like you to respond to this question by thinking about everything you've learned so far. First, I'd like you to think about what you read in the primary sources. Truman had something to say about what was causing this suspicion and animosity between the Soviets and the U.S. The ambassador to the U.S. from the Soviet Union had something to say as well, Novikov. And Henry Wallace had something to say as well, the Secretary of Commerce under Harry Truman, who disagreed with Truman with regards to the correct policy that the U.S. should take. Once you've had a chat with someone near you about these three different perspectives on what the who's responsible for the conflict, then have a look at these key developments. All of these, and you can pause it here for until as long as you need to. Um, these are the key developments that we've discussed. Either you've read about, we've talked about it in class, or I just went over them. These are the key developments in the early part of the Cold War, and they'll help you answer the question. So I want you to think about this. You're welcome to work with somebody if you'd like. Fill in the worksheet with by yourself or with a partner that the sub should give you, and then write a thesis statement. I'm gonna give you about 25 minutes or so to do that, and then I'm gonna ask the sub to ask you to turn to the second part of this lecture to learn about what happens in the 1950s as a result of the containment policy in the Cold War. But before you do, I want you to have a look at, I want you to think about how this prompt is different from some of the other ones that you've seen. Here are some examples of ones we've seen. So far, we've seen, prompts that ask you to talk about, the whether or not the Reconstruction improved the lives of African Americans in the U.S., whether or not whether or not the Progressive Era was harmful or beneficial, whether the Spanish-American War marked a turning point in America's relationship with the world. And what you see is that the prompts that we've seen so far have mostly focused on, have mostly asked you to stake a position. So for the first one, for example, Reconstruction improved the lives of blacks or it did not improve the lives of blacks. I've said to you over and over again that you have to make a claim, an argument that takes a position. Or the Progressive Era was harmful or the Progressive Era was beneficial. Make an argument, take a position. Or the Spanish-American War marked a turning point or it did not mark a turning point in America's relationship with the world. Take a position on this question. But this question is slightly different. It asks you to evaluate the causes of the Cold War. There's no position to take, or no clear position to take, if you based on the prompt. So you're going to still make an argument, stake a position, but you have to be a little bit more, look a little bit more deeply in order to do that. So here are some examples of when you're looking at a cause or an effect question, what you might do with it. So if you're analyzing the causes of the Cold War, you might say something like the Cold War was caused by the Soviet Union. Or you might say the Cold War was caused by the actions of both the U.S. and the Soviet Union. Or you might say the Cold War was caused by post-World War II economic circumstances. Or that 3 factors caused the Cold War, and then you go into detail on each one. The point is that there's lots of different ways to approach this question. So keep that in mind as you organize the evidence, write your claim, make your argument, then write your claims. And write a thesis and hand it in to the substitute in the next half hour or so. Thank you.